Welcome to the Writing Westward Podcast. I'm your host, Brenden Rensink. Today we talk with author Frank Bergon about his new collection of essays, Debunked Chuck and the Marlboro Man, The New Old West. Writing Westward is a production of the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies at Brigham Young University. Each episode features a conversation with an author or scholar of new works that explore the North American West. We hope that our discussions will spark your curiosity to learn more and think differently about the North American West as a region and its peoples, environments, histories, literature, and so forth. You can follow Writing Westward on Facebook at Writing Westward Podcast or on Twitter at Writing West. You can listen on our website, writingwestward.org, or subscribe and listen wherever you get your podcasts. We're listed on most major distributors. To learn more about the Redd Center, our programming, live-streamed lectures, funding opportunities for research and events, or anything else, find us at reddcenter.byu.edu. That's reddcenter.byu.edu. You can get more regular updates about the Redd Center on Facebook and Twitter as well. Frank Bergon is a novelist, essayist, and critic of the American West, its environments, peoples, history, and its present. A professor emeritus of English from Vassar College and member of the Nevada Writers Hall of Fame, Bergon continues to write and is deeply involved in trying to understand the connections between Western and regional identity and its actual and mythologized histories. Earlier this year, the University of Nevada Press published his new collection of essays, Debunked Chuck and the Marlboro Man. The essays are grounded in his childhood in California's San Joaquin Valley. In this region, he sees the intersection of many competing Wests, rural and agricultural traditions, like those of his own Basque immigrant families, as well as new economies forcing adaptation for ranches and vineyards, growing urban and suburban geographies, immigrant experiences, and more. They all overlap in the San Joaquin Valley. Here, Bergon uncovers dynamic regional complexity that mythologized takes on the region often obscure. How does a region reconcile tradition with the changing economic, social, and cultural demands of the present? Bergon may not provide all of the answers, but he certainly does ask many of the questions that we should be considering. Through Franz and Darrell Winfield of the titular Debunked Chuck and Marlboro Man, Bergon provides fascinating case studies into the overlapping New and Old Wests, identities imagined and real. Bergon's eloquent storytelling and musings illuminate our understanding of the West, new and old, and far beyond the San Joaquin Valley alone. Frank Bergon, thanks for joining us on the podcast this morning.
Well, thanks for having me, Brenden.
Where are you recording from today?
Right now, I'm in Oak Bluffs, Massachusetts, on Martha's Vineyard.
Oh, wow. Beautiful. Beautiful.
It is.
I was happy when your press mailed me this book kind of out of the blue.
Good.
And I'm always interested in bringing in people from other disciplines who are thinking about the West in different ways. And this book of essays was timely, and it's really exactly what I needed to be reading right now. So I was happy to spend some time with it.
Well, that's great. I look forward to it.
You present these essays as, a number of kind of personal reflections about the West broadly and narrowed in on the San Joaquin Valley. And you present the San Joaquin Valley as a place where the Old West and the New West collide and are currently being remade into what you call America's True West. So I wanted to spend a little time before we jump into some of the essays to talk about the San Joaquin Valley.
Okay.
Your background there, and maybe even a little bit of your childhood there. How do you, when you think of the San Joaquin Valley of your youth, what there makes it the Old West for you?
Well, when I think back or now, when I think back, because I grew up on a ranch, on my grandfather's ranch right in the center of the San Joaquin Valley in Madera County. And it was a ranch with horses, mules, sheep, cattle, alfalfa, cotton. And I lived in my grandfather's house with my father, mother, brothers, sisters, and aunt, all in one house. Mm-hmm. And he himself had a long tradition as a rancher. With his father, he farmed in Los Angeles, where he was born, and then moved and became a tenant farmer along the San Joaquin River around 1911, 1912, and that's where my father was born. So I grew up in a ranching community, ranching family. I also had on my mother's side a ranching family in Nevada. So, I'm a country boy, and that's what I remember. And I think since it was instilled in me with values, ranching values as a young kid, those have continued to the present.
Yeah, and it sounds like that is a childhood that has a lot of hallmarks of some Old West, not necessarily mythologies, but identifying markers that a lot of people think of as kind of the classic West.
Well, it is. It's when I talk about it, the San Joaquin Valley, and when I call it the New Old West, my point really is that despite the incredible technological changes that have occurred in farming since I was a kid, and so on, that people's minds and attitudes change more slowly, and I think that was really demonstrated when John Gregory Dunn, who is Joan Didion's husband, came to the San Joaquin Valley in the mid-1960s to write about the grape strike being led by Cesar Chavez.
Mm-hmm.
And Gregory Dunn had written about California and knew it well. But of course, what he knew was a California of Los Angeles, San Francisco, the coast, and so forth. When he entered the valley, it was what several residents called the other California, just how distinguished it is from those tourist haunts. But he said the thing that shocked him was how much the ethic of so many people in the valley was that of the 19th century frontier. So even though on the surface people's lives change, my point is that the Old West and New West don't so much collide perhaps as overlap, and that the values and attitudes of an earlier time, and especially with people who's of many generations, third, fourth, fifth generation Westerners, influence their present day lives.
How did your own family kind of square these conflicting or overlapping identities?
Well, it varies. As I said, I really have two families. On my mother's side, she's Basque. Both her parents and my grandparents were Basque immigrants. And my grandfather came over in the late 19th century, and my grandmother came over from the Basque country in the early 20th century. And I just might use them as an example to demonstrate how the important the attitudes of immigrants and migrants were in shaping this Western attitude I'm talking about. In the Basque language, there's a word called indada, which people applied, for example, to Basque sheep herders. And it means perseverance, toughness, strength, resilience. So you see how all those words are the ones we identify with the myth of the West too, the cowboys,
the rugged individual,
the rugged individualists, and all of this. Even though you as a historian know that history and mythology often don't coincide, they're not separate, and so I think that attitude, that Basque attitude, I think on my Basque side of my family, they think of it as being Basque, not necessarily Western. Even though several who are still in Nevada, and when I was growing up, they ran cattle. They were cattle ranchers. My grandfather, though, ran a Basque store and a hotel for Basques. With my grandfather and father and mother, they were my children of immigrants. And so they carried those attitudes into the West. And again, they're the commonplace Old West attitudes of this is a land of individual freedom and opportunity. But of course, being ranchers and farmers, they know that that coincides with disappointment and failure on almost a cyclical basis.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I mean, so it's a question of attitude, I suppose. And, of course, I and my siblings were no longer ranchers and farmers and so forth. We've gone off to different careers, but certainly those attitudes shaped us in many ways.
I think it's interesting. I mean, you quote Wallace Stegner saying rural California is like the rest of the West, only more so, which is such a great line. But there are a lot of places, especially in the rural West, where we can find these kinds of attitudes and identities and peoples, up to the present. The San Joaquin Valley, though, does seem to really exemplify some of the modern tensions of technology, of suburban growth, of the urban and rural divides that I think exist in a lot of places around the West. But the San Joaquin seems like a really great place as a case study to examine these overlapping worlds.
I think that's the point. It's not distinctive from the rest of the West. In fact, that's a point I try to stress, how it's the Intermountain West and the Great Plains and other areas share much of what I'm talking about as existing in the San Joaquin Valley. But as you point out, in a way, the San Joaquin Valley embodies all of those tensions and attitudes and conflicts. There's a good reason why people used to say, don't Californicate our state. And, well, it really meant that what was happening in California would eventually happen in other states as well. It was just that it was happening first. And I think that given that in many ways, the San Joaquin Valley is this intense farming community rich in racial and ethnic heritage, where the technology of farming is changing rapidly, it embodies or signals what's happening throughout the West in an intense way. So, I'm not making a point, it's so completely different from the rest of the West. Not at all.
But it gives us a glimpse into things happening all around.
It does.
I mean, you mentioned your Basque heritage. You have this chapter entitled Basque Dirt. I'm talking about a man named Mitch
Lascoiti.
I knew I was going to mispronounce the name, so I'm glad you jumped in.
Yeah.
Lascoiti. He started as a Basque sheep rancher, and it has now become quite a large landowner. I'm doing quite well. And again, this kind of interesting overlap between Basque identity and what we sometimes think of as real traditional Western identity. You're asking him why it is that he keeps on buying up ranches and land, and he says, I just like dirt. I'm Basque. I have an affinity for dirt.
Right.
Which in the rural West, we often do get these stereotypes and these ideas of a real connection with the land, and that there's a commonality amongst the people of the Old West is that there is a premium on not just owning land, but having a connection to it and staying put on that land, being dedicated to it, which is different from how we sometimes talk about the New West, which is a population that is highly mobile and sometimes, especially if it's more urban or suburban, more disconnected from the land itself. How do you see that tension playing out? Is there as we lose this connection to the land for some of us as Westerners, what is the loss of culture or community, as exemplified through this Basque example or through others? What's lost in that?
Well, what's lost is exactly what you're talking about, that tradition and community and a sense of continuity to your life. I mean, we do get meaning of our own lives from the past. I think, what you're pointing to in talking about these changes is something that's fundamental that's happened. What's happening today, as you know, is this, we read it in the press all the time, this big split between rural America and urban America.
Mm-hmm.
And we read in the press, well, we gotta understand these country people a little bit better. We have to understand what these rural people are thinking. And then it's forgotten. Or people come down and do stories, and from my point of view, they're often influenced by preconceptions and stereotypes. And if you go looking for stereotypes, you're going to find them.
Yeah, you'll find what you look for. Yeah.
Exactly. So that's why in telling these stories, I didn't have when I began, I had no agenda. I was writing for a couple magazines, a few stories and profiles, and then they just began to accumulate. And as they accumulated, what emerged was this theme that we're now talking about, the New Old West. But the point that I'm getting at finally here is the big stunning shift that has occurred, that when my grandfather arrived from Southern California in the San Joaquin Valley and began, as I said, as a tenant farmer, half the people in America lived in rural areas, lived on farms and ranches. Now 1% live on the farms and ranches that produce the food. So all of those ranches or areas that produce food are split between those, and I'm talking about the county that I grew up in, Madera County, and several people that I write about in the book who are third, fourth, and even fifth generation family farmers, and others who are in what my dad used to call bedroom farmers, who are just owners of large tracts of land that produce produce. So, there's two splits between rural and urban, and then even in rural community and ranching community, there's this other split. So when you have only 1% of the country living on ranches and farms, they're not going to have much clout in larger culture.
I mean, this is the irony, is that we often think of the West as a more rural region, but per capita, I mean, from the numbers I've seen, it's the most urbanized region. More Westerners live in urban and suburban settings than in rural, than in any other place in the country.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's becoming more so. I mean, the way what's happening in California, the way that the San Francisco Bay Area is actually just spreading into what's generically called the Central Valley.
Yeah, this suburban sprawl, right?
Right.
I also think there's something quintessentially Western, though, in this story of transformation. We talk about Westerners' resilience, of their adaptability, of their not just ability to persevere, but to change and transform, in the face of challenge. Mm-hmm. And so there is something maybe quintessentially Western also then about some of these regional transformations.
Well, there are, and because of the way I write and the sort of books I write, I immediately begin thinking of individuals.
Yeah.
And so what you're saying, what pops into my mind are some of the people that I write about. One interesting person is the Korean immigrant came over and calls herself a Korean Okie. Because she was adopted by an migrant Dust Bowl family. And she said, even though I'm Asian on the outside, I'm really more like them, the Dust Bowl Western Okies inside, and share their values. Now, again and again, this seems to happen with other migrants and immigrants who move into the region. There's a kind of shared value system that emerges, and it's certainly clear-cut in her case. She openly professes it.
Yeah, you bring that up with Lewis Owens as well, a Native American novelist who kind of self-identified also as an Okie, and a kind of a real unique set of identities there. Let's talk a little bit about Fred Franzia.
Okay.
Who I think some people may know the Franzia name without realizing they know it, from the grocery store. And Fred's influence with his vineyards and wineries. How does he kind of exemplify this adaptability and this state of transition in the West and in the San Joaquin Valley? Tell us a little bit about Fred.
All right. First of all, I want to say that all those wines you see with the Francia label
are not him.
Are not his.
Or they used to be his family's.
They used to be his family. His uncles and father sold it first to the Coca-Cola company, and then they sold it to others. So wine in a box. And this was a great source of angst to Fred when this occurred. And his model was his grandmother, who was an immigrant, came over when there were just rattlesnakes and sagebrush on the San Joaquin Valley, started a small vineyard, then a winery, and worked on the line into old age. So he got this, in talking about the attitudes that continue, he got that attitude of perseverance and hard work and resilience from his grandmother. Mm-hmm. So what happened was he and his brother and cousin started their own company called the Bronco Wine Company. They started from scratch. And first he was involved in the bulk wine business, and he was selling wines to Trader Joe's. And he was selling a $2.99 wine, Argentine wine, to Trader Joe's, and they came to him and said, well, we'd like a $1.99 import. And Fred went to his brother and said, I think we can do this. And so he developed the wine, which with the label Charles Shaw.
Which was he was going around buying up lots of labels, existing labels, right?
Right, because he didn't have his own name. He couldn't use a Francia name.
Yeah.
So what he was doing was when wineries would go defunct, he would buy their label. So when he was flipping through his labels, as he told me, looking for a label, he picked Charles Shaw because it was once an elite Napa wine before it went bankrupt. So he called this wine Charles Shaw and sold it. Trader Joe's sold it for $1.99. And this was in 2002. There was no advertising. And in the first year, it sold 1 million cases. And it became the fastest selling wine in history. Then by 2016, he had sold 1 billion bottles. No wine has sold so many bottles so quickly. So the mystery was, how did he do it? Well, going back to your original question, he was an innovator. He's a fiend for work. I remember exchanging emails with him in his office on Christmas and New Year's morning, because I knew I could catch him. So there's the mystery of Fred. He's very private. When a PR man came to work, he told the PR man, I want no press. Well, this person had come from working for Robert Mondavi, the famous Napa Valley vintner, who wanted all press. Mm-hmm. And so the real mystery about Fred was, how did he do it? Well, he's an innovator. He's an adapter. Nobody in any other book has figured out how he could make this profit by beginning to sell wine at $1.99. That's how it picked up the moniker $2 Chuck.
Yeah.
So it's called $2 Chuck.
Which maybe is not a term of endearment, but he got the last laugh, didn't he?
He did. He did. Yeah. He always refers to it as Charles Shaw.
Yeah.
But, it's an interesting story. I mean, so how did he do it? It's, executives in the big wine companies have told me that the cork and bottle alone had cost him $1. Mm-hmm. And then the distributor takes 30% and the retailer takes another 30 or 40%, and there's absolutely no profit. So it was a complete mystery how he managed to do it. And there were all these myths. You were talking about myths that arise, whether urban myths as well as Western myths. And one was that after 9/11, he bought all the bottles of wine from the airline companies because they could no longer use corkscrews on the airplanes, and he got all that wine, which of course was a false story.
And then he was just repackaging it and giving it to Trader
Right.
Joe's. Oh man.
Right. But basically, it's a bit complicated. But he went to Trader Joe's and said, "What I'll do is give you an exclusive. This wine will only be sold in Trader Joe's and nowhere else. But you can't take your usual 30 or 40%. You have to take much less."
Mm-hmm.
So the rest is history. And now he is the biggest vineyard owner in the country with close to 50,000 acres of grapes. They like to say officially it's 40,000 acres. And they're moving, they're all organic vineyards.
Mm-hmm.
So he keeps adapting. To save money, he changed the cases from white cardboard to brown cardboard. He developed his own trucking company. He built a railroad tracks into his main winery, though they have several around the state. And yet, the thing is, he still works in the original construction site trailers. And when I last visited him, I mean, he takes great pride in this. There's the industrial carpet on the floor with holes on it where you can see the particle board underneath. And some of the holes are patched with duct tape. And he's sitting there. And his PR man said that's how he likes it. He wants it to be just like the old days.
Yeah, and again, yes, we see these overlapping. He's an innovator. He's modern. But there's still this pride in like this old West sensibility.
And surprisingly, he still does. When he goes into towns, he still wants to go to the local Don Chewy Mexican restaurant and eat. Where there's no table service, you get your own tacos and sit at the side. When he negotiates with farmers, he does it with a handshake. And then after the crops are in, they go and settle up and even determine the price afterwards, not before. Things like that. That's what you would call the old style.
Yeah. Also, you had a story about a woman named Irene Waltz,
right?
A native Californian Indian,
right?
And her, experiences growing up. And towards the end, you start talking about the history of genocide, native genocide in California, and revealed that even in her own personal history as a native Californian, that she actually had ancestors on both sides of some of those genocidal campaigns of the mid and late 19th century. And it got me to thinking about how many Westerners, and we see this in Fred's story and all the other stories, that many Westerners, and maybe it actually is the hallmark of Westerners, is these split identities and these competing identities that, and maybe this isn't unique to the West, maybe this is everybody everywhere, but we often like to think of ourselves as a certain thing. I'm a Westerner, or I'm, I grew up in Washington, and I very much think of myself as kind of a Pacific Northwest boy. But competing with that are all kinds of other things. We all have our split allegiances and identities.
Well, I think, what you're pointing to is really the complexity of American life that's maybe intensified in some ways in some of these people's stories, but that we at great peril ignore today. There's this great absence of nuance, and of course we always want things simplified,
black and white.
We want people, we want good guys, we want bad guys, and we want people who are clearly Native American. Well, you mentioned Lewis Owens. We'll get to Irene in a minute. Lewis Owens thought of himself when he was growing up as a migrant. He was treated like an Okie. His parents migrated into the valley. They worked as laborers. And when he came to my class, he came as one of the most famous Native American writers in the country. Well, the fact of the matter is many of the Dust Bowl migrants share Native American heritage, Choctaw, Cherokee, and so forth. So it's too complex to present to the reading public. Well, here is this fellow who's mixed Choctaw, Cherokee, Welsh, Irish, and so forth. So he's presented as a Native American writer. But what he told my students, he said, I wasn't discriminated against as a kid as an Indian. You can look at my features and see why. And so again, there's that mixed blood heritage that makes a difference. But he said, we were always the poorest family in every town we went into. And that was a great embarrassment to me. So that's what really shaped him. And his story as a result is very complex for that reason. But of course, he's even to this day just celebrated simply as Native American.
Primarily, though, he thinks of himself as kind of his foundational identity was that of a poor migrant farmer.
That was foundational, but then eventually he wrote a book about it. He said his mixed blood heritage. He's proud of his mixed blood heritage, and he wrote a book called Mixed Blood Messages. Now, Irene is interesting, and I think, her story allowed me to write about the decimation of California Indians. And not many people realize that California had the biggest and most diverse Indian population in the continental United States. And during that period from the gold rush for the next 20 years, the slaughter of the Indians was the most intense of any in our history. And yet, as she said, that story isn't told.
Yeah. And not just intense, but intentional.
Intentional.
You mentioned to her reading Ben Madley's book.
Right.
I texted him a picture saying, hey, you're getting a shout out in Bergon's book. But there's a number of really great works coming out, really highlighting that. And,
yes.
And like Irene said, California Native history, and that is not part of California identity. It's not part of how California tells its history, outside of maybe like the mission experience, right? Which is a very mythologized part of, that California kids learn in elementary school, and they build their little mission out of sugar cubes in the 4th grade or whenever it is.
Right.
But
the rest of the story isn't told.
So how does that play with Irene then in her identity?
Well, as she said, what happened in that part of the San Joaquin Valley where we both grew up, as an anthropologist said, it was the most intensely decimated area of California because of the gold rush primarily. Well, missionization, it began with the missions because many of the Yokut Indians from the valley were taken from the valley to the missions. But the real decimation that occurred during the beginning with the gold rush. So what happened is she grew up in an area where there was no tradition. She knew she was different. She had a great aunt and a great uncle who lived with her, but she didn't have, as she pointed out, any connection to a larger community, tribal community, as the Hopis did, as the Navajos did, because so many of the tribes or peoples that she was connected to were then extinct. So there was that sense of loneliness. And it was only when she went off to college, and it was the beginning of the American Indian movement, when she met other California Indians, that she began to develop this sense of identity, which she internalized as a Native American. And then she became an official member of the Chukotsi tribe, in which she's still very active now as a officer in that tribe.
Well, and you mentioned, that she and others people knew that they were Native. It wasn't that it was a hidden thing, but there just wasn't the same assumptions and identities lumped together with that. Some of her siblings assimilated very well, some associated more with Hispanic communities, because there wasn't a Native community there to be rooted to.
There were in the mountains. The thing is, they didn't fit the stereotype of an Indian.
Yes.
Of the Plains Indians and so forth.
Yeah. Which gets to, there's these ideas of, authenticity and what real Indians are and are not. And
this is one of the ironies of our time, I think. And now there's this intense need. Okay, we have to find the authentic. And the more we search for the authentic, we're presented with media creations of the authentic. Yeah. So as a kid, I mean, she read about Indians, as she pointed out, in school, but they were always Plains Indians, bloodthirsty Plains Indians, and with feathers and so forth. And these weren't the Indians like her grandfather and others who were in the mountains.
I mean, this is why with my students, next semester I'm teaching a seminar, like a Western American Studies seminar, and it all kind of revolves around identity. And I think it's so much fun to play with, because the more that you try to search for authenticity, the more elusive it becomes, which is, for me, kind of the point. I like talking about Western identity and mythologies because they do have a lot of power. But in your introduction, you say, too often the West gets jammed into popular stereotypical extremes of the mythic West or the debunked West, one legendary and romantic, the other brutalizing and empty, both cartoonish, which is really the point that I like to get to with my students, that we assign so much power to these myths, and it becomes kind of a chicken or the egg situation where we buy into a mythic West and we then try to perform it, and it becomes part of who we are.
Exactly.
But it is empty and somewhat cartoonish.
Exactly. I think, that's one of the things I try to investigate in my story about Darrell Winfield, the Marlboro Man.
That's what I thought maybe this would perfectly lead to. So very interesting to find that you were close personal friends with Darrell Winfield, the Marlboro Man himself, and maybe introduce to our listeners how he represents really this idea of really the most mythologized image we have of the Westerner, and then under the surface, how much more complex he was as a person.
Well, let me see where to begin.
Yeah, I know.
I mean, first of all, begin with the Marlboro Ad Campaign. I mean, it says something that the Marlboro Company in 1955 began trying to change Marlboro cigarettes from a feminine image of a woman's filter cigarette. They developed what they called Marlboro Men, all these tough, rugged sailors, lumberjacks, football players with tattoos on their hand, and cowboys. The most popular image was the cowboy. In 1962, they bought the rights to the theme song, The Magnificent Seven. I don't know if everybody of a certain age remembers that song. And that's when Marlboro Country was introduced. At that time, up until then, for the most part, they were using models. The first working cowboy came in, Carl Bagley, in 1963. Darrell Winfield was somebody that I had met in 1962. He was a working cowboy. He had come when he was 6 years old from Oklahoma during the Dust Bowl migration, grew up in the San Joaquin Valley, always wanted to be a cowboy all his life, and became one. I remember looking at those ads and said, Winfield, you look more like a Marlboro Man than any of those people in ads. He just laughed it off. Eventually, after he got into the cattle business, it went broke for various reasons. He then moved to Wyoming, the Quarter Circle 5 Ranch, in 1968. It was owned by somebody in my hometown, Madera, California, that he knew, and so forth. The Marlboro people showed up on the ranch with some models, and they saw Darrell Winfield, chippy nice and with a mustache, and they went crazy. They took some test shots. Philip Morris Company, the Leo Burnett agency, looked at the shots and thought this is what the kind of person they were always looking for. They got in touch with him and said, we're doing a shoot in Texas. We would like you to come down to Texas. Now, being a cowboy and a prankster, he thought that some of his cowboy buddies were trying to trick him to get on a plane and go to Texas and make a fool of himself.
Because what would be more embarrassing than and pretentious,
Right. So he said to them, well, we're pretty busy shipping cattle. If you boys want to take my picture, you better come up here, which they did. And I remember at that time, I opened up Life magazine, and there was a full-page picture. I said, that's Darrell. So I called up his wife and said, wow, Darrell's now the Marlboro Man. I said, what do you think about it? Oh, she said, I don't know if that's so good. And but anyway, he went on from then on. For the next 20 years, he was the focus of 85% of the commercials and ads in the Marlboro campaign. Marlboro cigarette shot to the top of being the best-selling cigarette in the world. He never stopped being a working cowboy. And from 1968 to 1974, he remained a cow boss for the Quarter Circle 5 Ranch. In 74, after the cattle market collapsed, he moved to Riverton, Wyoming, and bought the first property of his life, 40 acres of a horse ranch, which he expanded to 80, continued being a horse rancher the rest of his life. So for 30 years, he was the main Marlboro Man. And of course, there were other cowboys who were in those ads. They were what they called feature cowboys or non-feature cowboys. For example, a wrangler who might incidentally be in a shoot. But in the press, as everybody knows, thought, well, I thought the Marlboro Man was dead of lung cancer. And that was reported so many times in the press. In 1992, the Philip Morris Company told the New York Times, well, you can look at many of the cowboys that we've used and call them the Marlboro Man, but Darrell Winfield is the Marlboro Man. And that continued all for 30 years. He was the main Marlboro Man. He phased out after that, and other cowboys became feature cowboys. But you can see him when he was 68 years old in a Marlboro commercial on YouTube called Rope Dance, if somebody wants to take a look. Okay, what's interesting about all of that, when he was interviewed by the Museum of American History, he was kind of close-lipped. I mean, even though he was a real storyteller and a jokester and so on, until he made this shocking remark that he said that his life really, he didn't think that becoming the Marlboro Man had changed his life that much, had made any difference in his life. Now, his point was that he still got up every morning, went to work every morning, put on his boots, and he had the same friends as he always had, ate the same food he did, though he had quit smoking and was eating bison instead of beef, but he was basically the same person. But he's the exact opposite of the cowboy of Western myth and film. Mm-hmm. That is, that person who was always fighting Indians. Well, he happened to be married to a woman who's enrolled in Choctaw tribe. Mm-hmm. He was adopted by the Arapahoes in Wyoming. Also, the mythic cowboy, even the one emphasized in commercials, is of that strong, rugged individualist. And Darrell is one of the most communal family men you can imagine. He's always been surrounded by family. He's got had a ton of children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and great-great-grandchildren. So he's just the opposite of that Lone Ranger riding off into the sunset saying adios to the woman behind him.
Yeah, so, I mean, the public thinks they're looking at the quintessential cowboy, and in fact they are looking at a true ranching cowboy who really is authentic to the region, but not in the way they think. They think they're looking at a cowboy who's this rugged individual, and they think they're looking at the mythologized cowboy and imposing on him all these things that he actually isn't, because he's actually the real deal.
That's exactly
that's fascinating. Exactly it. Yeah.
I mean, and rather than those individualistic values which we tout as being those of the rugged, lone, gunfighting Westerner. Darrell Winfield's basic values were communal.
Yeah. I mean, you say the true story of the American West is not of independence, but interdependence.
Exactly.
And I mean, the more you study the Western history, that is true. It's just not the myth that we often are raised on. I mean, I was really struck, towards the end of his life, you present these scenes where he is battling cancer, and who is he surrounded by? Not just family and friends, but native peoples coming to his house to hold sweats, to do Arapaho healing ceremonies for him. I mean, that definitely does not square with a lot of the Western movies.
Not at all.
Right. Who would have guessed that, maybe the truest Westerner there is a deeply complex and nuanced person, right? Not the stereotype, not the cartoonish stereotype.
No, in fact, as you suggest, he shatters that stereotype.
Yeah.
He even shatters the stereotype of the Marlboro man who died of cancer, of course, because they did find a tumor in his lung, and he refused treatment because at his age he asked the doctors. One doctor gave him, I forget what it was, 6 months. The other gave him 2 months to live. And he said, well, tell me the name of somebody that you operated on and did chemo and radiation and was still alive today. And they couldn't give him a name.
Yeah.
So he did, as you said, he went through the healing ceremonies with Indians, also used a medicine that he used on his horses and cattle.
Which that's just so perfect.
But then 6 months later, he went back and had x-rays in it, and this tumor had shrunk. And the doctor said, well, keep it up.
Yep.
2 years later, there was nothing but scar tissue. So I wanted to make the point that he lived until he was 85 years old and died of a heart attack in January of 2015.
My dad grew up on kind of a farm out in the rural county where we live in Washington, and grew up with cows and stuff, and he still has this cow salve. Watkins still makes various forms of cow salve, but they're not as good as the one he grew up with, and he still has this old red tin. I don't know how long he's been milking this tin of cow salve. I mean, as long as I can remember, anytime I got a cut, or something, not Neosporin, no, you get a little of this cow salve, put it on there, and he still uses it. And the story of Darrell using this some black substance that usually is used externally on horses or cattle. He was swallowing the stuff, and
he was
there with the cancer.
Yep. So as he said, well, you could say there was a connection, or you could say there was a coincidence, but something worked.
Yeah. Well, why this is really important, I think, is you also bring in a brief discussion of the Bundys and some of these anti-government movements which have come up, kind of this second edition of the Sagebrush Rebellion, and this idea of the mythology of the Western cowboy and who he is and what that myth means has real world impact, because you bring in this example in the early 80s of this kid Claude Dallas who comes out to the West to become an outlaw and a cowboy, and there's a certain kind of this Marlboro Man idea that he wants to go out and perform and become, and he ends up killing some Idaho game wardens, and now more recently we've had the Bundy standoff in Nevada, the Malheur occupation up in Oregon, with people trying to perform a certain idealized version of what they think a Western cowboy is. But in Darrell Winfield, we see that they're misreading what the more authentic Western man is.
I think this connects to where we began our discussion, because people are trying to live out a myth which is basically false. And in doing so, they're facing situations. I'll just talk about this standoff, and where the old industries of ranching, logging, and mining are disappearing. People are losing their jobs, and there's understandable anger and so forth. The problem is how to deal with that. In adopting what is really a mythological figure who really never existed and saying that this is the true way we have to deal with these changes
in
our world, produces violence, unnecessary violence. They're not doing what the real Marlboro Man, Darrell Winfield, did. They're not doing what Franz did. They're not doing what the real Westerners did in the San Joaquin Valley, which is to hold on to their values, but to adapt and change.
There's a powerful lesson here. I think about not necessarily the responsibility that the media has necessarily in perpetuating myths, because we like stories, and there's no problem in telling stories until someone takes maybe the worst reading of those histories and tries to implement it in the present. Then we have real trouble. So so that's why I really appreciate these essays and not just necessarily the reintroduction, but reinforcing the reality that the West in history or in the present is complex and messy and nuanced. And any time that we are presented with a stereotype, we should be very skeptical, right? Because there's no black and white answers to modern problems. There were no black and white answers then either in the past.
Well, I appreciate that perspective, because I think there is a problem. I'm not going to mention any, but within the last year in major magazines, there have been 3 essays about the San Luis Valley in Colorado, about the San Joaquin Valley, and about Tucson, Arizona, down on the border. Uh-huh. All 3 are by people from New York who approached the subject with preconceptions. And as we said right at the beginning of our conversation, what they found thought they found, were the very stereotypes they were looking for. So, and as you said, this is how these various misconceptions of the West, why so many people in rural America feel that they're misrepresented, even invisible. I heard that complaint all the time.
Invisible, wow, yeah.
So, what I tried to do with this book, and I think what we have to do, I think you were making this point, is if people would go and start with the actual living people themselves before they begin with generalizations, that in that way we're going to come to a much richer, more nuanced, more complex understanding of rural America, which all the media is telling us we're supposed to do at this time.
Yeah, and we desperately need to, because there are real serious issues that need to be dealt with in the region, and so we need to approach it with more care. I'm reminded just a few days ago, High Country News published a book review, a book by Christopher Ketchum, published by Viking.
Yes.
This is a major trade press book that's going to be in Barnes & Noble and airport bookstores, called This Land, How Cowboys, Capitalism, and Corruption Are Ruining the American West. And High Country News' critique, the headline of the book review is "The West is More Than Heroes and Villains." So, I know nothing of the author, and I'd like to pick the book up so I can kind of weigh it for myself. But their critique is kind of what you're suggesting, that someone came in looking for stereotypes and found them, but that's not going to get us towards any real solutions of, the region's issues.
But, that goes back to, you were making that point about how the West is jammed into stereotypes of either the legendary West or the
debunked, right? Yeah.
Yeah. And that's exactly where that particular book fits. Mm-hmm. And it not only appeals to people's preconceptions, so you immediately got all the bad guys out there, but then it fosters the misperceptions.
Well, as a lifelong Westerner, now I've literally made a career out of blathering on about the region. I appreciate the nuanced take that you have presented for us. I thank you.
Well, thank you very much.
Do you have things coming up in the future that we should keep on our radar?
Well, I have a new book. What It's called The Toughest Kid We Knew, the Old New West. And what I do is move back in time and write about my immediate farming family and boyhood community. So that'll be out in May.
Great. And who's publishing that?
Nevada, University of Nevada Press.
Great. So this was the New Old West, and that one is the Old New West.
Right. So both books have been published by University of Nevada Press.
Oh, that's great. Well, I look forward to getting my hands on it, Frank.
Okay. Well, thanks very much.
Thanks so much for chatting.
All right.
Take care.
So long.
Thanks for listening to this episode. Writing Westward is a production of the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies at Brigham Young University. Our theme music was provided by local Utah composer Micah Dahl Anderson. You can find him at Micah, D-A-H-L, Anderson with an O.com. I'll include a link in the episode description. Besides subscribing to the podcast, you can receive regular updates about upcoming episodes by following on Facebook or Twitter. My name is Brendan Rensink, and I serve here as the podcast host, producer, sound engineer, and pretty much everything else. So if you have any praise or critiques, you should probably just send them my way. I'm Associate Director of the Redd Center and an Associate Professor of History here at Brigham Young University. Feel free to contact me if you have any questions about the podcast, the Redd Center, our live-streamed lectures and events, funding opportunities, or anything else. If you have books you think I should consider for an episode, please send them my way. One last plug, I'm also the project manager and general editor of a great digital public history project hosted here at the Redd Center called Intermountain Histories. You can check it out by visiting www.intermountainhistories.org or download the free mobile app by searching Intermountain Histories on your Apple or Android devices. There you can read carefully curated histories of the region, complete with archival photos, bibliographies, and more. In any case, thanks again for listening to the episode. We'll see you next month.